2016 QULOC Forum. I'm Bob Garrity, University Librarian at the University of Queensland and the current convener of QULOC. By way of background to today's event, I'd like to share the introduction from a recent paper that Wendy, Abbott, and Justine Cawley wrote for Australian Academic and Research Libraries, Queensland University Libraries Office of Cooperation, 25 Years of Collaboration. In 2016, BULOC/QULOC marks the 25th anniversary of its establishment. Originally founded as BULOC, the organization was formed as an initiative between three Brisbane University libraries, Griffith University, Queensland University of Technology, and the University of Queensland, in 1991 to foster and promote collaborative ventures among its members. By 1993, due to much interest from institutions outside Brisbane, BULOC had evolved into QULOC. Today, members include all university libraries in Queensland, 2 university libraries in New South Wales, Southern Cross and University of New England, and 1 in the Northern Territory, Charles Darwin University. The State Library of Queensland holds observer status. Reflecting on the activities of the organization over the past 25 years provides insight into the major changes that have taken place in libraries over that period. The collaborative ethos of QULOC, combined with the enthusiasm of its members, has played a major role in assisting its member institutions to respond to these changes. Common themes of tightening budgets and coping with and responding to the information technology revolution, along with providing value to parent organizations, have framed the library profession for the past 25 years and will no doubt continue to do so into the future. QULOC affords its members the opportunity to discuss the issues of the day and learn from each other while they navigate and deal with constant challenges in a changing landscape. This is the real value of the QULOC model, and its impact on the library profession in Queensland and beyond can be seen in the number of collaborative projects and events that its members have engaged in enthusiastically. So the program today is built on the themes of collaboration and change. We'll have 4 presentations, the first 2 describing innovative and collaborative work currently taking place, and the second 2 providing some reflections and perspectives on QULOC over the past quarter century. To start off, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Mitchell Whitelaw, Associate Professor, Digital Design Practice, School of Art, Australian National University. Mitchell is an academic, writer, and practitioner with interests in new media art and culture, especially generative systems, data aesthetics, and digital cultural collections. His work has appeared in journals such as Leonardo, Digital Creativity, Fiber Culture, and Senses and Society. His current work spans materiality, data, and culture with a practical focus on creating generous interfaces for digital heritage. He's worked with a number of significant institutions, including the State Library of New South Wales, the National Archives, and the National Gallery of Australia, developing innovative interfaces to their digital collections. Mitchell's presentation today is entitled Collaboration and Digital Collections. Please join me in welcoming Mitchell.
Thanks very much, Bob. And thank you all for having me here. It's as a serial collaborator with libraries, one of the best things is hanging out with library people and talking at library events, because library events are fantastic. You have a very good kind of professional culture of collegiality and kind of information sharing, so it's fantastic. So this is a very nice opportunity to talk about some projects and to reflect a little bit on collaboration specifically and the kind of opportunities and perils of collaborating with libraries. And it's nice to be doing that. Well, I don't have any choice to be doing that, but from the outside. So I'm not a library person, I'm someone from the outside who has collaborated with libraries and other collecting institutions. And so I'll be talking from that perspective. I wonder if we can have the front lights down a little bit. Is that possible? Just so we get a bit more light from the screen. So a bit about me and where I come from. I come from a sort of odd trajectory for this field. I have a background as a creative person, a designer and an artist, and before that, oh that's great, a musician. I work with data as a kind of material, and I work with all kinds of different data. This is a piece that is made out of image data. This is a piece that's made out of temperature and rainfall data. It's a physical object. So data as a material is definitely something that I'm into. This is also made out of data, but this is a visualisation of the collection of the National Archives of Australia. That project's on the web. All of this stuff, all the stuff I'm showing today is live on the web. You'll be able to track it down, and there's a lot of URLs. I'll also share my slides after this. So yeah, my work in general tends to move between theory and practice and sort of shuttle back and forth. I'm almost always working with data, but working with it from a cultural context as something to make with, so as a kind of creative material, and also something to think with and to think about, so data as a kind of critical material. But also I added another C to my list. It's also very much a collaborative material. One of the things that I'm learning as I do this work more, one of the great things about working with data is data always has provenance. It always comes from somewhere, it always belongs to someone, and it also always connects you with the world, with often a part of the world that you didn't know about previously. So data is a great kind of vector of connection. It actually brings a whole context, along with it. So, and I kind of blithely moved into, probably 7 or 8 or 9 years ago, blithely started, thought to myself, look at all these all these cultural institutions, they've got piles of data, that'd be fun to play with. Yeah, I was right, but also what I didn't realise was that data would bring with it a whole rich kind of set of concerns and contexts and practices and professional, work and knowledge, all that kind of stuff that comes with the data. I've done quite a series of collaborative projects of institutions of different flavours, from archives to galleries and a number of libraries, and private and public sector as well. And I won't go through anywhere, all of these today at all, but I'll just pick out a few and try and do some case studies. Is it going to work? Nope. So, my focus today is specifically in terms of collaboration. Well, it's what I know about, which is collaboration specifically via the digital and digital collections as the kind of point of contact, and I'll talk specifically about that terrain. I'll look at some case studies, and I'll look at them through 2 different models of engagement, because I think one of the things that is interesting for me about digital is that it opens up different models of engagement and collaboration, which are probably historically different than those that libraries have traditionally engaged in. And one of them is kind of straightforward traditional model, and the other is what I would call unsolicited engagement, or maybe feral, which I think are also quite interesting and potentially very rewarding, but also potentially problematic in a number of ways. And then just to talk a bit about opportunities and risks for moving into those kind of collaborations. So just a bit of demo. This project I'll say a bit about, and then I'll give you a little bit of a tour of it. It's called Manly Images. This is an example of a collaboration supported by the State Library of New South Wales. And the basic background to the collaboration was SLNSW was interested in the collections that were held by local libraries, and specifically at local studies image collections. So a number of local libraries, as you probably know, have large collections of historic material from their community. In this case, Manly Library had a collection of community stuff, including council archives, local schools, sporting clubs, all that kind of stuff, which had been digitised and was sitting in a very generic kind of library media interface. But our hypothesis was, or the State Library was interested in, feeling out a model for changing the way that these kind of collections could be navigated and exposing them, celebrating a little bit more. I won't get into the technical stuff right now. I'll just show you the project. And I apologise if you've seen this before. Can I get a rough indication of, has anyone seen this before? Is this new to everyone? No? Great, okay. So I'll just explain a little bit about what we're seeing. One of the interesting challenges, the things that have kind of kept me coming back to this kind of work, is these collections, these digital collections and cultural materials are so rich that as sets. They're so full of value, full of interest. They're so diverse. There's so much interesting stuff in them. And yet the question of how you represent those things is really challenging, especially if you want to represent them in any way other than here's a search box and here's a list of results, which tends to be our default. So I won't do my song and dance about that today, but you can look it up on the internet if you want. But basically I think that way is good for some functions and bad for many functions. In other words, I don't think search solves every question of access and discovery at all. So here the challenge is, well, how do you represent 7,000 images? Especially when they have very sparse metadata. These images, like a lot of these collections, is an image, there's a descriptive title, there's maybe a date if you're lucky, and maybe a very small amount of other stuff, a little bit of subject data perhaps. So this interface just really takes some very simple techniques to representing that, that set. The scrolling's very strange in this. First of all, it breaks the set into chunks, and it does that using quite a crude device. It looks for words in the title, breaks the titles apart into words, and then does a kind of a frequency table. So it's a little bit like a tag cloud, except the terms are actually coming from the item titles. So you can see there's a big segment with the word uniform attached. That by itself doesn't give you very much context, but in combination with the image that you can see behind it, and that's one of the items that belongs to that cluster, you get more of a sense of what uniform means in this sense. And you can also see street, school, road, club, view, stain. If you know anything about Sydney geography, you'll see some suburbs there. There's Seaforth. The size of each tile is roughly proportional to the number of items it contains. So you can instantly and at a glance get a sense of what's in this collection. So you can immediately say, okay, well, there's lots of military service portraits in this collection. In fact, there's about 1,400 of them, so almost a quarter of the collection is that kind of material. There's lots of photographs of streets and lots of schools. And as well as that, you get a sense of the visual texture of the collection. The fact that most of the images are black and white. Also the kind of genres, like portrait genres and other sort of photographic forms that are used. By bringing the images to the fore, the idea was to actually expose all that material and just make it available for someone who wants to explore this collection visually. The other thing you can do is just investigate. So if you click one of these tiles, you can dig into it, actually inspect its content. This is also another little set of facets here, so you can then browse those items chronologically. So you might then expose some material that you didn't find in other ways. There's a rare colour one from 1991. Sadly, this collection was digitised to video disc, so it's actually a very low quality digitisation process. So these are kind of second generation images largely. Screen is cropping my image. Just have to reload that one. So you can browse this whole collection to any level of depth, down to the individual record, without ever typing in a search term. That's the idea here. So that's Manly Images. It was an interesting project in a number of ways, and I won't talk too much about the technical stuff. As I've said, one of the interesting challenges here is how do you represent diversity? How do you represent the complexity in a collection? It's definitely trying to do that. And looking at techniques for how you can richly represent context in these kind of collections. It also uses a combination of interaction and autonomous display. So if you sit there, it'll actually just animate and transition. So the images in the background will gradually tick over. So you can actually do nothing at all, and you'll gradually see the collection exposed. In terms of the outcomes of the collaboration, the key thing here was a practical demo that illustrated the ideas we were talking about. One of the things that I have learned repeatedly in this kind of field is that nothing communicates as well as a concrete demonstration. When you're collaborating, especially across disciplines, and you're talking about abstract things like data, collection items, computer interfaces, none of that is as effective as sitting someone down and showing them how these things work. And so the value of having a real concrete thing that you can show and tell with is tremendously high. As part of the collaboration, we open sourced the code for this on GitHub, and interestingly, this collaboration was founded with the hope that these kind of techniques, by developing some approaches, by putting out the code, that other people would take it up, and that these techniques could be adapted to other contexts by other local libraries. Interestingly, that hasn't happened, which means that we were wrong in our assumptions that the take-up would happen, but also I think it shows up some of the limitations. I think it suggests some reasons why that's not happening, and I think a large part of it is capacity and access to the kind of technical resources and expertise that would support the development of these kind of projects. It's also another illustration of something I'll talk about later on, which is that just because you share it freely, just because you put it out there and make it possible for someone to take up an opportunity, doesn't mean the opportunity will get taken up. The other thing that's happened is that this resource is now featured and linked sort of in parallel with the conventional interface on the Manly Local Studies site, so it's adding value at the local library level, and it's also adding value at the state library level, where it's also linked and cited as an example of a research project. So it has sort of little feelers of connection with various different contexts. Another interesting thing that started to happen only in the it's been online for 3 years or more, and only in the last year or so, it's actually started to get organic web traffic, and by that I mean it's getting people finding it from Google searches, which is kind of interesting because I built it in a way that is completely the opposite of what everyone tells you to do when you're building stuff on the web. So it's completely dynamic, it's all built with JavaScript, there's no static HTML pages, nothing has tags or keywords or anything like that. So if you're a web geeky person, basically what this means is that Google's search engine is actually running all of the JavaScript and indexing all the content that the JavaScript's generating, even though that wouldn't otherwise be possible. But what that means is pretty cool, which is that people who are searching for, photos of Manly Hospital circa, 1947 are actually finding this site. So they're actually accessing the collection, from this portal, as well as probably from others. The other outcome here is a sort of an academic outcome, which is it featured in a publication that I had come out last year, which is talking about all this generous interfaces work. So once again, multiple outcomes in different domains, outcomes for the library, but also outcomes for me as an academic and researcher, and the same project doing multiple duty in different contexts. As a kind of looking at it as an example of collaboration, the things that made it happen, well, there was State Library, and State Library were prepared to fund it, but also there was a tremendous amount of local library goodwill and support. So Manly Library supported it and were prepared to offer their collection up as a kind of guinea pig for it, which was tremendously valuable. Shared values, very, very important. So both the State Library, the local library, and myself came to this collection with a similar set of values. In other words, look at all this incredible material, recognising the value that was there, or that although some of it was poorly described, that there was a lot of intrinsic interest and richness and quality, intrinsic in this collection, and that kind of ethos of valuing the material became really central to the collaboration, as well as an ethos of actually wanting to expose the material more effectively than the current systems were doing. So yeah, recognising that this is a rich resource, but one that was really quite underrepresented. We had a whole lot of aims in common. We shared the aims of that we wanted to pilot some new techniques and also share the results. The collaboration, one of the helpful things was that in terms of technical realisation, it was all DIY. I was building it and I was also hosting it myself. I didn't have to deal with any complex library technical systems in order to make it go, which is sometimes the case, and I'll talk about that a bit later. Another really important thing that's enabled this project and many others is a kind of digital infrastructure. And in this case, it was actually, Trove and the Trove API, Trove data, was actually the infrastructure that supported the project. So although Manly Public Library had a collection database with all of the images in it, and State Library of New South Wales were funding the project, the most efficient way for me to actually get access to the data was to just access the harvested standard metadata version that is stored in Trove, because Trove, I can write a few lines of code, instantly download 7,000 records worth of metadata, well, not instantly, in a matter of minutes, and that's everything that I need. So that's actually way quicker and way easier than working through the process of trying to do a database export from a specific library system, work out how to decode that and translate it. So the kind of general purpose, broad digital infrastructure, the value of it cannot be overstated in terms of how it can support collaboration. Trove lets you do this interesting loop, which I've done a few times. Anything that gets ingested into Trove suddenly benefits from that layer of infrastructure via the API. All of that stuff becomes accessible and harvestable. And once it comes out as structured data through the API, anything is possible. Anything, that any developer dreams up is feasible in terms of how that material gets treated next. So that is a tremendous layer of value that Trove service is adding. Now I'm going to talk about a very Queensland project with State Library of Queensland, just up the river. It's called Discover the Queenslander. I'll talk about it as I demo it. Some of you probably know this material. The State Library of Queensland has a beautiful collection of digitised pages and covers from the Queenslander supplement, which was the colour supplement to the, it wasn't the Courier Mail, it was simply was it the Courier or the Mail? Before the Brisbane Courier Mail became that paper. The predecessor to that one anyway. So the weekend colour supplement, the Queenslander, extremely beautiful stuff, and SLQ has about 1,000 of these digitised, and they were looking for basically a showcase, so a way to make this collection, to celebrate the kind of visual quality of the collection, to make it really rich, explorable, browsable, so to do a generous interface. For this little tiny slice, it's only 1,000 items, it's really tiny by library standards. So working with my colleague Jeff Hinchcliffe, we developed a web interface for this collection, which used some similar techniques to some others, but also introduced a bit of new stuff. So it uses that same kind of mosaic technique from the Manly Images one. Each of these tiles represents a single year worth of records. And you can actually navigate those records right there in the mosaic. So here's 1929, you can actually page through them. And they're all ticking over. So once again, you're getting an instant kind of visual snapshot of the qualities of the collection. And the size of the tiles, again, relates to the number of records in each year. So these ones in the mid-30s are really prominent. Anything that you find that you want to look further at, you can just load up and you get a nice, lovely high-res view. There's also a little bit of linked data going on here, so you can actually restore that item to its original content. So because all of these come from newspapers and all of the newspapers are digitised in Trove, you can actually go back and see that digitised version. Now the cover doesn't always look that flash because it's monochrome, but you can actually then go and read the contents. So you can kind of virtually stick the colour cover back onto the digitised black and white body, and you can actually go and read the contents. And once again, that was incredibly easy to do. Thanks to the Trove API, we know the date of issue of the covers, we can find the matching issue in Trove very easily and write a single script which goes and automatically matches all 1,000 covers with their matching articles. So again, applying a bit of really simple computational power to these kind of collections can add a lot of value very quickly. The other interface mode is this one that we call the grid. And this is where we got to play with a few other things. So first of all, just lots of great metadata, so nicely structured metadata. So it's very easy to go and browse by year, for example. So here we are looking at records from particular years. But as well as browsing by year, we can look at specific tags or themes. So so here we're looking at children's clothing. You can see instantly the prevalence of that theme through various years. You can also look at creators. So for example, here's the most prevalent creator, a wonderful illustrator called Garnet Agnew. And there's a sample of his work. And this starts to raise some interesting, or sort of put forward some interesting higher level questions. So one of the things you might notice about, see the pattern of his work in the year graph there, shows that Agnew created almost all of the covers for 4 years between 1926 and 1930. He created a few more in the mid-30s, but also created one in 1906. So he has this really interesting history with the publication, and you can actually see the very first one that he created, this one here, and he went away and then came back as a very accomplished illustrator and then produced hundreds of covers and illustrations after that. There's a whole story there that we don't know. He's not a celebrated artist or anything, but he's a tremendously important figure if you're looking at the visual culture around this particular publication. The really fun thing about this piece, though, is the colour. You'll notice that colour ribbon sitting under there. Colour acts just like any other metadata feature. The big difference is that we actually generate the colour metadata ourselves. So if you want to look at a particular colour in the collection, you can simply filter by colour. So we analysed all of the images and extracted a palette out of the images. That palette is a kind of compact representation of the colours in the image. And then those colour chips basically run a dynamic search for nearby colours. Colours are a very imprecise thing, so it can't be exactly the same colour. It has to be a colour within a certain range. So basically that means it's very easy and fun to simply browse by colour. And you also get to see relationships between colour and all the other metadata features as well. So technically that was one of the really great fun things here, was just inventing a completely different way to slice and dice the collection using a new collection feature. And something that again really celebrates the specific character of the collection. The central ethos here was that we just, as soon as we started working with these images, we just fell in love with the collection and wanted to do everything we could to kind of share that kind of joy with a wider audience. So that's Discover the Queenslander. Have a play if you haven't already. If I do that. No. Full screen. Yes, right. So yeah, I won't talk too much more about the technical features. You can play with those. So in terms of outcomes, very simple, a concrete thing, a microsite. In this case, it's actually in production on the SLQ site. We developed a whole lot of new techniques, so new fun things, ways of extracting colour, ways of processing and dealing with colour, so techniques that we can take and apply to other collections and extend. We also are using some new technical stuff sort of under the hood, some new frameworks. So one of the things with production-based work and practical research is you need to be constantly upgrading and developing your skills as a practitioner in tandem with the research, and that was happening here as well. This also features in the Generous Interfaces publications, and we also did a conference paper at Museums on the Web, which specifically dug into the colour investigations that we did and looks at other colour in other museum collections as well. And if you're interested in colour, I recommend that to you. So again, a whole lot of outcomes from different sides. To again just reflect briefly on the collaboration and how that worked here. What was nice was that SLQ came to us knowing the kind of work that we were doing and the principles we were talking about, and basically saying, yes, we want you to apply that work here. So it's nice when people come and ask you for something that you already know you want to do. And also, like I said, a shared appreciation of the collection was absolutely central. They came saying, we have got an absolute gem of a collection for you to work with. We love it. Here's why we love it. And as soon as we saw it, we loved it as well. So that shared ethos was really central. There were some really interesting technical constraints. So the site had to be delivered within the SLQ's content management system. So it had to fit inside the organisational and technical system that the library runs. That's completely fair enough, because libraries are organisations. They have to manage their web content. There's nothing worse than web content that has, is undocumented and has been made by someone years ago and no one knows how to fix it or change anything. And what do? You eventually have to retire it or kill it or pay someone a lot of money to work out what's going on. So playing nicely with the technical systems is tremendously important. So they were interesting constraints, and we had a lot of fun working around them, but that work was very well supported. So there were people on the inside of the library who were supporting us in doing that. That was great. It was a really iterative developmental process. So as we were building the thing, we were sharing multiple sketches from a very early stage. So we were showing really rough early work all along the way, and we were actually exploring the collection ourselves, trying to understand its glitches and interesting features, and we were actually able to share that experience with our collaborators at the SLQ. So they were using our sketches to discover things about the collection that they didn't know about at the same time that we were. So we sort of shared that developmental process, which was really, really good. One interesting unresolved issue that came out of it, and it's something that is a real, a significant one, I think, which is, I guess, the question of integration and specifically of data integrity. So the data that came from this SLQ for this project was basically a static export of the catalogue record of the collection database. We did quite a lot of work transforming that, cleaning it up, so removing a whole lot of kind of weirdness around the way things had been subject tagged and various other kinds of things so that it would work well for our little application. Now, the kind of metadata or, other librarians, in the room will probably be going, ooh, that's a bad idea. You've just taken a copy of this data and now you're doing things to it. Yeah, we were. And of course we then realised, we sort of hoped, maybe it would be possible for us to take all of that value and sort of give it back in some way that the library system can actually benefit from that work. It's actually not that easy at all to do that. So what you end up with is a split. You end up with a little piece of the collection, which is living over here, doing things, which is different to the real actual collection over here. And the two cannot be reconciled, and anything that happens over here, any changes or extra value which is created, will never ever get back to its real home in the digital collection. So that splitting of the data and that question of the disintegration of data is really critical. So now I just wanted to talk a bit more briefly about a couple of unsolicited engagements, sort of AKA feral projects, and talk about the way that digital collections material can support this kind of work and why I think this kind of work's interesting and valuable. I'll really quickly show you this work. It's called Succession. It might not even fit on this screen. It's quite a small little screen. This is a funny little thing. It's really it's very much an arty work rather than an interface work. It takes image content from a variety of different collections, and all of the image content is related to a specific place, the city of Newcastle upon Tyne in northeast England, which is where I was spending sabbatical a couple of years ago for a few months. I got really fascinated by the city and by its history and its heritage, and I wanted to do something that somehow responded to all of those ideas: industrialisation, deindustrialisation, the history of the book publishing industry in the city, the history of the natural sciences, and the physical experience of being in amongst that in the city. Wow, that's actually a really beautiful one. I'm going to save that one. So every time you press the reload button, it generates what I call a fossil. It takes 5 images and it smashes them together in a way that's kind of semi-random, and it makes a strange new thing, kind of an artwork that's made out of archival sources. Importantly, this one's missing some. They're still loading. It actually is preserving those sources, and it preserves their navigability. So if we want to find out who this woman is, we can go and find her in her original context. This is one of the images from an amazing, just insanely kind of mind-blowing resource, the Internet Archive book image stream. Don't know if any of you have seen that on Flickr. Internet Archive have been doing bulk book digitisation, so they take the books that get de-accessioned by university libraries, saw the spines off, feed them into a hopper, run them through OCR, put them on the internet basically, so where they're copyright clear. And the result is an insane archive of printed material. They have a Flickr stream which just shows the images, so a machine that seems to be not text, so in other words they're images or figures, and they just bulk upload them. So their stream currently has 9.5 million images in it. So it's a great illustration of the way digital cultural material is moving beyond any kind of human scale of comprehension or encounter. How do you encounter 9 million images? Nobody actually knows. You can search them, they're all tagged and so on, but as a kind of cultural resource, that's unknown territory. So Succession takes these resources and jams them together into new things, and it does that in order to try and investigate some speculative ideas about the past, the future, industrialisation, all kinds of big ideas. You can see a list of the previously saved ones down here, and then you can go and retrieve them. And you can also find their sources. So this is one that I really like. It's got one of these great engravings of the mills. Again, this is Internet Archive. So anyway, so go and play with Succession. It's entertaining. This is another nice example. So this image combines all kinds of weird layers. The white thing on the left-hand side is a 1970s era tram, a metro light rail system that was being brought into Newcastle upon Tyne. There's also a coal loader from the Weymouth colliery on the very last day of its operation. So that colliery shut down in the 1980s, I think. And then there's also this little duck here that's about to land in that puddle. That's actually John Gould duck. So John Gould's Birds of England book was engraved and published in Newcastle upon Tyne. So that's the printing industry in Newcastle. And all of these things kind of jam together in a way that sets off sparks for me about the history of industries and the way industry relates to environment, all kinds of other stuff I won't bore you with. But what is cool is that is a citable thing. That is a thing that has a URL, it's on the internet, you can go and look at it, you can go and actually investigate all of those sources. So there's Gould's duck. So this is a kind of a little illustration of unsolicited engagement. It's a little bit of a hybrid, but I'll just explain how it works. So first of all, I have a corpus. A combination of machine and hand kind of picked about 2,000 images out of Flickr Commons. Now, Flickr Commons is a big pool. A lot of different institutions and collections contribute to it. Tyne and Weir Archives and Museums were the local sort of collecting agency in Newcastle. I used a lot of their stuff, but also British Library, a lot from the Internet Archive. All of that gets picked kind of at random and jammed together by a machine that just picks the images and lays them out and then renders them, and then generates this sequence of fossils. Even with only 2,000 bits of source material, the number of combinations is kind of unimaginably vast, so you'll never see the same one twice. So it's basically going to infinitely generate new fossils out of all of these elements. You'll never, definitely never see the same one. So what's interesting there is, for me, is that this was a bit of a hybrid. I was in Newcastle and I was talking and engaging with the people at Tyne and Weir Archives and Museums. They supported the idea. They introduced me to their collection. They showed me their stuff. I thought it was fantastic. But in terms of actually material that I could work with, it was only the Flickr API. It's only when I got onto that actually stuff started to happen, because via an aggregated collection like Flickr Commons and an API, I can suddenly access a whole cross-section of material that was relevant to my interests, to that city, but that was actually distributed all around the world from all kinds of different institutions. So aggregators and APIs actually make this kind of unsolicited engagement really easy. In fact, they make it kind of the default rather than the exception. I talked about the archive.org collection model, so being able to tap these kind of astronomically big collections so readily via an API, again, is tremendously valuable. All of the stuff that's there is licensed to be able to be reusable. So it's Creative Commons, which means that I can legally reuse it, remix it, and republish it because that's what the license is designed to promote. And I could build this thing and independently host it and publish it. So the whole thing can be done really, on the smell of an oily rag and very readily and very independently of any of these individual collecting institutions. Here's another example. This is a little tiny piece called Macaulay Remix. And it's a thing that I made as a kind of a test to see, okay, how quickly can I make a project like this? I made it twice. I made it the first time, it took me about 4 hours, and then I sort of remade it, and it took me about another 3 or 4 hours the second time. So Cornell Lab of Ornithology has a library called the Macaulay Library. It's the world's biggest collection of wildlife audio. It has 115,000 records or so in the library. And this interface will let you hear any of them. Well, if you're lucky, we'll be able to hear the black-throated barbet.
LNS catalog number 6747.
It's a bird of very dry thornbush country and appears to have 3 songs. First, the most distinctive one has got the following rhythm. And seems to be often done. Secondly,
Wow, I've
it
never
has
heard
a single
a recording like that one before.
LNS catalog number 74567.
Mostly they just have the bird. But there's a reunion bulbul from Mauritius. So the interface is incredibly simple. It's a giant tag cloud, and it just uses the titles of the recordings, and you can see immediately, what's there. So you can just pick something, and you get a random sample from something that is linked to that term. So this is a hooded warbler, but you can see that there are also hooded grosbeaks, hooded monkeys, hooded cuckoo shrikes, and various other things. So you can see a bit of the relationship between all of these terms, and you can also just randomly explore the collection. So there's lots of different babblers, black-throated, brown, chestnut-crowned, etc., etc. So again, this was a really quick little experiment, and the idea was, okay, how quick, given a collection of this scale, how little do I need to do to make something that is radically transformative in terms of being able to access the collection in a completely different way? So that's really what this is trying to do. Also, it's just a really fun thing to do, to listen to weird recordings of bird songs. And it works really well on a mobile device as well. It's designed with a very simple layout, so it works quite nicely on mobile. So it was a fun little exercise for me to do, but it also revealed a couple of interesting things, and specifically about this model of unsolicited collaboration. So like I said, it was a rapid-fire interface. It builds on another person's work. So Ed Summers, who's a wonderful librarian programmer in the United States, he saw this resource and actually scraped all of the metadata. So the step one was actually scraping the metadata out of a web interface. So that's just a script. So there was no published data. There's no API. There's nothing published in any structured way. But Ed wrote a script that scrapes the metadata out. So it basically generated a simple collection record for each one of those things. And that's the data that I used. It was built, like I said, in an afternoon, and then it broke, and I had to rebuild it. And I'll explain to you why it broke. So in the original one, I hot-linked directly to the audio that Macaulay Library was hosting. So I didn't have the disk space or the money or the time to download 115,000 audio recordings and rehost them myself. So I just did a naughty thing. I just linked straight to theirs. That practice is called hot linking. It's normally kind of seen as a little bit impolite on the internet, but given that there was 115,000 bird calls, I decided I'd do it. At some point, and I don't know if it was because of this or for other reasons, Macaulay Library changed the way they were offering their media. They basically stopped allowing hot linking, so that they weren't publishing the stuff in any way that could be hot linked. But an interesting thing happened. They now actually have a way to explicitly support the embedding and sharing of content. So they now actually say, would you like to embed or share this audio? Here's how you do it. Here's how you do it the nice way. Here's a little bit of HTML with an iframe that you put in. Please format it this way. They even let you give them a little parameter so that they can make it the right size. So basically they had, in response, well, I don't know if it was in response to me or in response to other unsolicited engagements, they had actually changed their service to facilitate unsolicited engagements, to facilitate people using their stuff, embedding it, doing stuff with it elsewhere on the internet. And in response to that, I said, fantastic, thank you very much. I'll use your new technique and I'll rebuild the thing so that it works in the way that you want it to work. So that demonstrates, I guess, what can go wrong in this digital world of kind of remixing and mashing up, and also what can go right, and the way that it takes two to tango, really, that that collection holders can facilitate this kind of practice, but also that doing stuff on spec can result in things breaking because you're relying on potentially fragile kind of connections. Okay, so in closing, I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about risks, opportunities, and why libraries should collaborate. Risks first. The first one is first one's both. Digital collections, what all of this work shows is some of the attributes of digital collections. They're massive. Like that archive.org one, they're actually inconceivably massive, and that's a challenge that I find really charming and interesting. They're also mobile. In other words, they get around. I can access the collection from anywhere. Anyone can access it from anywhere else. And also, anything that's published on the internet can be copied and it can be re-instanced. It can move. So things can travel, but they can also be split, copied, and propagate around the place. They're also malleable. In other words, they can be changed. And again, as you know, that can be a scary prospect that things can be changed, but that's the reality of digital collections. Part of that malleability is really positive. It means they can be transformed into better things. But of course, part of it is potentially negative as well. So that is also a risk. Some of the added value that happens in this kind of world, especially with these things moving around, some of the added value is easily lost. Data can get separated, links can break, any extra kind of input can be lost to the real core of the collection, and thus to any kind of posterity or value that collection has. That's a definite risk. There are also plenty of risks around integration, the practical side of integrating with library systems. So library systems are systems. They, have all kinds of parameters around them in terms of time, resources, technical expertise, and integrating with them is hard. And so this kind of work can bump up against established library systems in a lot of different ways. There's a risk if you publish stuff that, you might publish it under certain terms of license and someone might do the wrong thing. They might breach your license. You might publish it as Creative Commons and they might rip you off and not give you attribution. That's a risk. But it's a risk that anyone who publishes material under any license takes. When you publish something with copyright, you're also taking the risk that someone will infringe your copyright. And if you do, you have recourse, and the same with Creative Commons. There's heaps more opportunities, I think. And this is also an opportunity. The fact that these collections are so big, so valuable, can be transformed so richly is a huge opportunity for the people who hold these collections. Because the malleability, the transformability, and the mobility of these collections supports new forms of engagement, new forms of presentation, new audiences, new forms of understanding these kind of works, which would simply not be possible in other ways. And that's the core of it. There are huge opportunities to do both traditional collaboration and unsolicited engagement. I'm not suggesting that one is a substitute for the other. They're both good models. The most satisfying experiences that I've had definitely have been traditional collaborations, in that they have involved real people with a real acknowledgement about the shared value of the material we're working on, shared set of aims and shared concrete outcomes. That is absolutely satisfying. But it's also fun to do crazy mashups with stuff that's out there, and to do it in the full knowledge that that's actually supported and sanctioned and productive. Digital infrastructure is massively important, and it presents an opportunity in that services like Trove provide a kind of baseline infrastructure on which we can build tremendously rich things. And that's something that, is kind of it's a public good, it's a commons infrastructure that's there. The opportunities here are to produce, I guess, both known and unknown, and that's the difference between engagement and unsolicited. If you know that there's an opportunity to do something with your digital collection, you know what it is, you have a clear vision, you understand where you're going, then absolutely you can do it. But the thing is, there's also 50 or 100 other things that you didn't know were possible to do with your collection. And by publishing your material in a way that allows reuse, someone else might discover some of those other unknown things that might be worth doing. So very finally, just a few little kind of take-homes, I guess, or in my opinion, for what should libraries do, what can libraries do to collaborate with digital stuff. First of all, you've definitely got to drive active collaboration. You can't just sit there and do nothing. If you want to collaborate, you've got to make it happen. Schemes like UTS Libraries, Artist in Residence, are really exemplary. I'm sure there are others that are similar as well, but the UTS one is just an example that I know. They do great work with artists, and their work with artists is actually translated into concrete changes in the library's own systems and platforms. So libraries have got to be active in collaborating, but also enable unsolicited collaboration. So that just means publishing material that is reusable, publishing content that's reusable, putting it out there and making it available in the kind of infrastructures that I'm talking about. Approach it with clear aims and values in either case. So having the shared ethos around the value of the collection material has, for me, been tremendously rewarding about working with this stuff. Definitely consider data integrity and systems issues. So if your collection's getting split off into new little chunks and pieces of data are out there floating around, how are you going to get the value back? If it's out there acquiring new uses, having new lives, getting around and being useful to people, that's fantastic. But have you got ways of bringing all of that material back into your library systems? To be honest, I don't think that issue has been comprehensively solved to my knowledge. Maybe people have good examples they can share, but I certainly haven't seen examples where that is being done in a really robust and systematic way. Oh, and that's all I have. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions.
Some questions?
Yeah.
If you're willing. So if you have a question, put up your hand. We have a microphone. Wait for the mic.
Thanks, Mitchell. Very inspiring. Not for me, but for everybody else. But it's a comment rather than a question. I was really taken by your enthusiasm and passion for Trove as a digital, underlying digital infrastructure. And it strikes me that you need to be going to talk to the politicians and the people who are trying to think about Trove in non-productive ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you for pushing Trove.
Yeah, no, well, not by accident, but also, yeah, absolutely. I note that, it's actually good timing to be talking about this stuff, and it seems like recently there have been some clearer commitments have been gained from Labor and from the Greens about funding for Trove. So, fingers crossed. Yeah. Straight to politics. Shuts everyone up.
Just curious about the Trove API. Have you had much interaction with the National Library? So were there elements that weren't available through the API? Did you provide feedback and did that lead to any changes, or were you able to basically use?
Because in general I've been using Trove content and that is aggregated content rather than NLA-specific content. So, as you know, Trove represents a subset of metadata from the native collection records, and it's a kind of a lowest common denominator subset. But so that's a trade-off, but the payoff for that is that you get access to a massive breadth of consistently federated content. So in general, I've worked with Trove, with the native Trove stuff. I work a little bit with Tim Sherritt, and so having access to someone who knows, how it works on the inside, I do occasionally get little kind of secret tricks, or he actually, sometimes they're not even secret, they're just obscure. They're things that, like open a whole area of the data structure and go, wow, I had no idea that was in there. So having access to people who know the data is always handy. But no, it's worth exploring, definitely.
And the issue of the added value being lost and the risk there. How many catalogers are there? Former catalogers. I mean, it strikes me that the issue of the color attribute for the Queenslander in a public library setting, you often have patrons who remember one of the attributes of a book. That's really rich. But in traditional cataloging, there's no place to put. Yeah. In traditional cataloging, there is no data element in a MARC record for the color of the book. So there is this kind of, I think, huge disconnect between the way librarians have standardized cataloging and the possibilities that the digital world makes available.
Yeah, absolutely. Mind you, there's also catalogues are also quite poor at capturing all of the kind of implicit, tacit, personal knowledge that librarians often hold about their collections. Catalogues are very poor representation of all of that richness of understanding. So catalogues can't do everything, it's true, but we can definitely add more to them. Yeah.
So have any of the commercial library systems vendors taken an interest in the work you're doing? And
I've certainly had some interesting conversations with some of them. In general, and I think I'm pretty sure publicly, I've been reasonably critical of most of their work because I see that it doesn't actually do much to promote discovery and access to collections beyond a very established search and list kind of paradigm. And so I've said those kind of mean things to their faces in some cases, and they've kind of gone, they don't really mind. People seem to keep buying their products and installing them, so I don't think they really care. They see this kind of stuff as a bit of a luxury or an added extra, I think, where it's like, oh yeah, that's kind of cute. It's nice to do that if you can, but really that's not the main business. The main business is getting people that journal article that they really want. I don't think it's really on their radar. I think oddly, probably these kind of approaches get more attention in related fields like kind of organisational information management, even kind of like decision support, sort of logistics. So other related fields where people are dealing with really large, complex, heterogeneous data sets and they need to quickly gain an appreciation of them. And that's not unique to library collections, that's a whole range of fields, yeah.
Heather.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting talk. There are a couple of things that occurred to me when I was listening to you. One, you're a great advocate for why we need changes to copyright legislation in this country, because we have so many unpublished treasures in our special collections that would just be ideal for the type of work that you're doing. Yeah. I guess one of the other things that struck me as I was listening to you, one of the issues that people have to think about is with the mashups. So mashups are absolutely fascinating, but dealing with donors that give us their collections, often donors are very nervous on how people are going to use those. Yeah. And I can remember having various conversations with people recently that donated a whole bunch of photographs to us. And they were so nervous on how people were going to use the photographs, and especially how the photographs depicted Indigenous peoples in the 1800s and how they were employed and free labor and stuff like that. So I think that's another thing you have to be aware of, because we will get people that will be saying, oh, I don't want this used in a mashup, and how can you control a mashup? And the reality is you can't control a mashup at all. So
Yep.
You know, that's another issue that is a very hard one for us to try and deal with.
Yep. Yeah, though, I mean, Creative Commons gives you the granularity to specify that. So Creative Commons, you can say no derivatives. And so you could have a Creative Commons license with no derivatives, which means that you can reproduce the image intact, but you cannot make any derivative work from it, and that would be in the terms of the license. So CC gives you a little bit of ability to specify that, though you then are really relying on the integrity of the user to honour the terms of that license. And even though Creative Commons license seems to be very simple and easy to interpret, I think there's very little literacy about actually what those things mean, especially among the consumers of that content, more among the publishers of that content than among the consumers of it. So yeah, I agree.
Any final question, comment? If not, please join me in thanking Mitchell.
Thank you.
So our next session is a departure from the published program. Originally, we had Dr. Sharon Saunders from Griffith University, who unfortunately, due to illness, is not able to join us today. But fortunately, Louise was able to call in a few favors, and we have two presenters from Griffith's e-Research Services Group who will talk about supporting research through partnership, exploring collaboration between HDR candidates and information professionals. So we've got Mr. Malcolm Wolski, who's Director of e-Research Services at Griffith University. He has particular responsibility for improving research data management practices, infrastructure, and collaborative solutions. Malcolm is a contributor nationally and internationally in the areas of information management and research data support. He plays an active part in assisting research groups to build information systems that manage the capture, collection, and preservation of data, to develop collaboration and communication tools, and to use advanced information technology tools and techniques. He's part of the senior leadership team providing library, information, and IT services at Griffith University, and he works closely with national service providers delivering IT infrastructure to Griffith researchers. And Mr. Andrew Bowness is Support Services Manager within the e-Research Services Group. He's worked on research projects such as the Climate Change Adaptation Information Hub and the Biodiversity Climate Change Virtual Lab. He and his team maintain Griffith's investment in research technology and seek to ensure researchers have skills and the support to use the research tools effectively. So they'll do a presentation, and then Louise will do a Q&A session afterwards. Great.
Hello, everyone. Okay, that's a little bit low. All right, so my name's Andrew Bowness. As the introduction has said, I'm from e-Research Services at Griffith. I was going to give you a little brief overview of what our group actually does, but before I launch into the slides, I will put a little caveat on there. We've only just done the slides at lunchtime today because we found out at 4:30 yesterday afternoon that we were presenting today. We haven't practiced and we're not 100% sure who's saying what. There are grammatical errors and spelling mistakes in the slide. I can vouch for that. I can identify some of them, so please be gentle. The introduction's covered off a little bit. Oh, actually, I was going to mention one more thing. It's very text-heavy slides. We're not actually going to read the slides. We trust that all of you can read. So just you guys read the slides and you can get copies afterwards so you'll know what we've actually talked about and can go back and have a look at the links. So unlike the previous presentation, not much by way of photos. Our group's a bit interesting in that we do mostly software development for very niche research needs, and we also support the high-performance computing. There's a lot of outreach activities that we undertake as well with our researchers to get them on board with a lot of national programs that are available. So there's an astonishing array. I think the last list was 380 free services provided by the government for researchers. So trying to keep on top of that kind of demand of tools and things that are out there to wrap your head around is a little bit hard. There's a lot of interaction between our group and a lot of library services groups at the university, so Louise's groups. And so it makes this a little bit interesting given that we're a central group. A lot of universities have this function devolved into various schools and things like that. So we kind of cover the whole gamut from genomics to history to all sorts of fun things, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So with this slide, I'm talking a little bit about the day-to-day interactions where librarians and e-research services meet, and then we're going to get into the interesting stuff, which is actually what's the sort of space-age future trajectory of all this sort of stuff. Discipline librarians are really important for our group because they actually provide a lot of the outreach and a lot of the communication to the research group. So they're kind of embedded with the research centres, they're going in and talking to them about their information and data needs. What we do is feed information in. Well, here's some of the portals and publicly accessible bits of information that are out there that they might be interested in. We actually manage jointly a research data service, so I'm sure it's a pretty common requirement across all the unis to have research data being managed in a fairly centralised and controlled way. So that includes research storage, repositories, metadata standards that are applying to those sorts of things. The other thing we do is hacky hours. So some of you may have heard about this. It's quite common in all states in Australia. So it's kind of a drop-in session to help researchers with programming needs and data issues. It's a very informal session, so it's a support and sympathy. You might have noticed a lot of IT people in the various schools are isolated and don't get to talk to other people who understand the types of things that you're interested in. So hacky hours is one of the things that we do to kind of help bring those people into the fold. And again, a lot of Louise's staff come along and talk or will refer information back to her group as a result of those sessions. The last one I'm going to mention on this one is the software carpentry, which is the more in-depth workshops. And again, Louise's group, the library basically does a lot of the advertising, comes along, participates. So it's kind of very much a shared space at Griffith at the moment between the library and e-research. I get to point at Malcolm.
So I'm just going to talk about some of the national drivers that starting to take effect. Those of you who have heard of NCRIS, the National Collaboration Infrastructure Research Infrastructure Strategy. It's not an organisation, it's a strategy. But just more recently, late last year, they've published their open data policies, and we're starting to see a lot of conversations in the federal government about opening up their data. They've funded CSIRO around the Data 61 with quite a large chunk of money to open up, get a lot of data out of the government agencies. And even, and I'll talk about some of these a bit more, the science and research priorities, there's about eight of those, where they're going to focus on the next few years. The other driver is just the cloud services, so NECTA's the National E-Research Collaboration Tools and Resources. We get used to the acronyms. So there's a lot of cloud services that the federal government's funded in infrastructure, as well as the Amazon Web Services and the commercial offerings. So in a lot of cases, the infrastructure is becoming, the hardware infrastructure is becoming much less of a problem. It's more around the data and the tools where the interest lies. Also, because of a lot of funding and just, I guess, a natural evolution, is a lot of the researcher communities are getting together nationally and internationally to develop solutions and repositories. So while we're trying to get a head around what's happening within the institution, a lot of the disciplines are like genomics are helping themselves. Also internationally, there's a lot of international activity at the moment. I'll talk about the Research Data Alliance a bit later on, as well as just the general technology developments in the Internet of Things. You've no doubt heard about the smart cities programs that are going through about connecting up street lights and all sorts of things, sensor networks. There's also all the citizen data that's becoming available, and just the commodity computing stuff you can get off the street now, basically. So data is becoming more dynamic and in bigger volumes. Yep.
Just as one extra thing to add to that set of slides, one of the interesting hallmarks of this new approach is that we're actually not in control of a lot of the infrastructure that researchers are moving on to. So in our
our organisation, for example, for Turn, so Griffith staff can go to Turn, put their data there, we don't necessarily know that that data's there, and often the library's asked, okay, well, where's our research data? And the answer is, well, some of it's here, and some of it's here, and some of it's here. It's very hard for us to actually get that information back from those bodies. Same thing with the Nectar and RDS services. They can go direct and start putting their data out into the world and sort of bypass a lot of university processes. You go.
Done. So the last tranche of NCRIS money was 150 million. A fairly large chunk of it went for hardware, so the high performance computing areas, a lot of storage. But I would think overall the majority of it's actually been in data management, collecting data, processing data, moving data, and developing tools to do the analysis of it. So while $150 million sounds a lot of money, when most of the work around tools and data is actually people's salaries, it's not hardware, and that tends to add up. The other thing about the NCRIS money and where we're moving in the national space at the moment is there's huge numbers of entities involved. So most of the projects and the activities are actually collaborations and federations. So we're moving right away from people building single solutions with an incorporated entity. So most of them are operating more or less on handshakes. And just collaboration between researchers and IT people and information management people. There's also quite a bit of work going on at the moment to look at those collaborations to get into sensitive data and medical data. That's going to lift the game quite a lot, because that'll get us into the health space. And just to give an example, the Biodiversity and Climate Change Virtual Laboratory as an application runs on this federated infrastructure. So when we talk about the storage and the servers that's funded by NCRIS, there's the actual hardware sits in 6-7 states. There's petabytes of storage out here at Polaris at Springfield, as well as servers. So there's another lot in New South Wales and South Australia and stuff like that. So the application for the Biodiversity Climate Change Virtual Laboratory runs across 3 or 4 of those physical nodes. So it's a completely cloud-based application running across hardware that's in multiple states. The data comes from about 4 or 5 different locations, and it's all processed and ingested on the fly. So we're moving right away from a single data room and an application inside an individual organisation. And as mentioned earlier, that makes some of the reliability and the sustainability interesting when you're relying on data ingested from another provider, because we don't own most of the data. Just to give you an idea, they're the organisations that are funded by NCRIS. The column on the right is the legal entity that actually is running the project. They're not organisations, they're projects. And some of them, like the Australian National Data Service, have been running for years. The other interesting thing that's happening now is we see a lot of collaboration across projects. To give you an example, the Biodiversity and Climate Change Virtual Laboratory is a sub-project funded by Nectar, which is the 6 or 7 from the bottom. But we're getting data from the Australian Atlas of Living Australia. We're getting funding from 3 or 4 of those other organisations, and also the infrastructure's been funded from one of those projects. So a lot of the activity is starting to run across projects, which underneath them have got different universities and organisations, which makes contracts very interesting. Just getting back to the research priorities, and you can find this on the federal government website. I've just pulled out the health one. And the 2 things that stand out about that is a lot of the focus is on data and making better use of data, not new data. In most cases, it's existing data. So a lot of it's about integrating data. The other thing, again, is common is collaboration and partnerships, and just more about working together to mash that data up in all sorts of ways. And while they talk about data sets, and you're probably thinking Oracle databases, but it could be MRIs, it could be anything, so it's all sorts of data. It could be video, whatever it takes. The Research Data Alliance, so that's an international organisation funded by Australian government, the EU and the US. ANZ is, the Australian National Data Service, is the sort of the key Australian agency. They're looking at all the things that would, addressing all the things or the barriers that are stopping us from sharing data internationally. There's, I think, 27 working groups and about 46 interest groups at the moment, and a few more coming on stream shortly. If you're in a university library, I'd suggest having a look at the Research Data Interest Group. There are some very specific ones on legal interoperability or wheat data, or and what they do is in the interest groups they identify a problem, and then they set up a working group, and they've got to deliver something within 18 months and have it in use somewhere. So it's quite focused, as usual with a lot of interest groups. Some take off and some die a natural death. So they, but they generally, and that's okay if they've addressed the problem. But you'll find lots of things in there about things like standardising exchange between repositories. There's 2 repository certification bodies in the world, and they've now agreed to use the same checklist. So Duraspace and all those organisations are on this group as well. So it's a good one just to keep an eye on. Do you want to talk about projects?
Okay, so that's pretty much the high-level view on terms of where the government's heading and the funding, and you saw the big dollar numbers. So I'm going to go through a couple of projects that have actually been funded out of that initiative and talk a little bit about how important information management actually is to some of these projects. In fact, it's pretty much the whole project. So Hive's a new project for this year that we're kicking off at the moment that's in partnership with ANZ Oren, which is the Urban Research Data Networks, all the sensor stuff, map layers, all that type of thing. QSIF, which you may have heard of, and the Gold Coast Hospital and allied health clinics at the Gold Coast and that sort of thing. Predominantly what this project is about, though, is developing a platform for integrating disparate data sets and bringing them together and making that data useful for researchers. So there's quite a number of, I guess, significant information management challenges that are actually part of that process, because obviously all these different groups keep their metadata in different formats and standards for quite valid reasons, because they're using it for different purposes, and we've actually got to try and integrate those data sets. Hive's quite a large project. I've just got a little diagram that kind of shows the project lifecycle for this one. As you notice, the word data is used repeatedly in this diagram. Pretty much the whole project is a data project rather than a technology project. And so there'll be a lot of information management people working on this particular project. It's just getting started now, so there's not too much by way of detail in terms of what it does yet. And some of the other health projects that are related to it is like the Logan Together project, which is like a 10-year project looking at health impacts on kids. Again, it's bringing in, you can see the themes kind of forming here. It's bringing in disparate data sources together so that people can actually interact with them and actually identify, trends in health in regions. So population health is a big one. And Epidaurus is, again, similar thing, but more of a GIS, so more of a map layer type thing. Again, all these projects are pretty solidly on information management. The biodiversity, climate change, I raced through those ones quickly to get onto this one, because this is actually one that's basically finished and I've worked on, and you can go to the link and log in and have a look if you've got AAF. One of the interesting things with this one in terms of, for example, citation of outputs. So if I'm a researcher using BCCVL, when I log into the system, I'll actually go to that. It'll give me a link to Atlas of Living Australia, so I can search within the tool and bring data in about, say, where koala species are located. I can then actually go to the NCI, the National Computing Infrastructure, and get satellite foliage coverage maps from there, combine that with that data set, and actually have a look and go, I need some WorldClim data. So, okay, I'm going to get WorldClim data. And all these are available within the tool, and all of the citations for those data sets are actually part of that tool set. The interesting thing is you're then combining that. So we've had to negotiate all the arrangements and agreements with those data providers because it's all automatic within the system. You're then using some algorithms to process that information. And again, there's citation going back to whoever originally wrote those algorithms. It's sort of a public open source foundation that kind of does that type of work. And then using climate layers from WorldClim and combining that and working out where species live into the future. And eventually you go through these processes and you've got an output data set, which might just be a map with some dots on it. But in terms of the attribution for that, it's quite an interesting attribution chain that you're trying to describe on that data. So on this particular project, we actually had a full-time information specialist kind of working on this project to help us navigate, well, what's the metadata we need to capture at each of these steps? How do we integrate it into the system and record it? How do we do the citations at the end for these types of projects? So even though it's a technology project, again, these things are completely dependent on information management, and so we'll often pinch people from the library to come and work with us on these projects. The next one that I'm going to quickly talk about is one that Rebecca Brown, some of you may know Rebecca Brown, worked on. And it's, again, another interesting example of just how, I guess, dynamic some of these projects are and how the responsibilities are quite devolved. So this one is very much a contract agreement-y type project. ICLIM, I won't talk too much about the Asian Development Bank one, but ICLIM involved Rebecca actually working with the knowledge managers in the different countries that were part of the product, so Vanuatu, Tonga, Fiji and Samoa, and actually helping to sort of federate government data for the entire Pacific region on climate adaptation information. So in that case, what she was doing is actually working with government representatives to define metadata schemas for their own repositories and for the subsets of data, coordinating with the national knowledge managers, identifying data sets that are actually useful, fit for purpose, and help the national groups manage their data better. So there was a lot of facilitation workshops, there was a lot of creating of knowledge products, and a lot of travel for Rebecca all around the Pacific to kind of check things out. So again, it's the whole sharing of data and information through open standards is just a reoccurring theme, and it's making up 80 to 90% of our work at the moment. So, and the hardest part for us is not necessarily getting IT people to work on these projects, but information managers with a library background who can actually come in and meaningfully interact with people about how to get data to talk to each other. We put prosecutions in here, which is a good thing we did because it actually interacts with Trove as well. If you want something that's actually entertaining to look at and less boring than the other projects that I was talking about, this is a really good one. So this is an example of citizen science project. So one of the things I've actually found is the documentation from historical trials is very hard to read because everyone's got really spidery handwriting with like big pointy loops and spilled ink all over things. So computers can't actually read it. So what they've done with this one is gone to Trove and gotten newspaper articles and things like that about crimes in Queensland. I think it's restricted. Oh no, it's everywhere. Yeah, it's all Australia. And brought those data sets in, but they've also got the scanned-in versions of the historical court records. So what they're getting people to do is to come in and they get access to all the material about court cases, but they have to transcribe the legal documents for us because computer can't do it. And then they actually make a narrative of the whole court case and make that available where you can actually see all the primary source materials and that sort of thing. So it's a really interesting example of a citizen science project bringing together Trove data and court data from all the states in Australia, opening it up to the general public and getting them to actually do the translation work for us to create these really interesting narratives. But if you do get a chance to check it out, there's actually some really interesting sort of legal stories in there. And I think that's it for me. Yes. Last slide.
It's on reflection, there's four key areas when you look at skills. There's the technical skills, information management, engagement and partnering, and the domain knowledge. So Typically, as we've evolved with the IT people, they've had to pick up a lot of information management skills and some domain knowledge if they don't already have it. People who come from the library or the information management space have actually had to pick up technical knowledge, and a lot of them have already got some domain knowledge. And we also employ some people who come from faculties and then train them up with information management and technical stuff. But the one area we've all been light on is partnering and collaboration and engaging, especially with external groups. We've all got a bit of experience doing it internally, but looking at a lot of these collaborative, loose federations, you've really got to know how to play nicely with other people and be clear about what you can and can't do, and just working for a common outcome, I guess. And some of it has never been done before, so it's a bit iterative. You get a few things wrong along the way. The other thing that's very apparent for us is that most of the collaborations and partnering are long-term. It takes quite a while to build the trust and the relationship before you actually get into the real work. So you could be engaging with some of these external groups or projects for up to a year before you actually start to really move along. But quite often, once you move along, more opportunities pop up. So it's, I guess what we're looking at is in our position descriptions and roles is to try and allocate more time to that than we do at the moment, because there is a lot of effort goes into it and it takes a lot of time. The other one we've already spoken about, the management integration from multiple sources, the data problem. I think this will become even more so with machine learning. We've already struck places in the looking at the things like spatial data. If you want to run a machine learning algorithm over the top, you've also got to build some stuff in the metadata so those algorithms know how to handle the data sets. And I think we're also moving to a more of a concept around data as a service, rather than putting data in big repositories and having some sort of something in between you and the data. As we get into a lot of the machine learning stuff, it's really going to, people will be able to run algorithms straight at data sets. And it's figuring out how to do that in real time, where the data is and where the compute power is. So there's a lot of thinking going on around that concept at the moment. And we're starting to see it in a lot of the open standards in the UK, where they're, even in industry now, they're starting to put the data standards down to the data source. They're not worried about extracting data out. So they're trying to give access to data at source and process it at source. But it won't happen overnight. And the other thing that's becoming much clearer is, and some of our projects already, is the boundaries are blurry. And this is really interesting with the legal side and copyright, and even in some of the Research Data Alliance interest groups around that legal interoperability. Some of those have been having a discussion for 18 months. I've been watching this document get developed about the principles. So OSGOL in Australia and a lot of the international ones are sort of trying to grapple with the different jurisdictions, the different concepts of copyright versus Creative Commons and a whole lot of things to work out how we actually share data outside of the country, let alone between states, which is another story again, and then within the institution, and who owns what data and a whole lot of issues. So that's becoming really interesting about how we're going to handle that. Do you want to say more on that? I think that's it. That is it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's working now. At short notice, I think that's been an amazing presentation to show us some of the connections and the collaborations that we have between our e-research colleagues and information professionals. Do you want to grab a chair for a second, guys?
We weren't sure you could have a panel of two.
I think you can. I think you can. If you count me, it's 3. How's that? I guess one of the things that I was curious about is you mentioned the different tools and the different requirements for understanding data management. How do you stay abreast of that? How do information professionals try to stay abreast of the emerging tools, the emerging tech that's coming out in this world?
I suppose from our perspective, it's probably a little bit easier because we're actually attending a lot of the meetings. So for QSIF, so if you can kind of think about the structure, you've got the NCRIS stuff, it kind of rolls downhill, then you've got the Nectar stuff, it rolls downhill to QSIF, which is the Queensland node for the Nectar stuff. We're on the board of that and we attend the meetings, so we hear about here's what's happening up here. But the difficulty is that it's so broad and so diverse, we can't possibly know really what's going on. So it's just mostly conversations and attending meetings and going, oh, that's really interesting, I'll look that up, basically.
And I think there's two areas there. One's about that partnership engagement. So if you, like we've probably in the last 12 months made a deliberate strategy at targeting a couple of the NCRIS projects like TURN, with it's the Terrestrial Eco Research Network, ORAN, which is the Urban Research Network, and have lots more conversations with them. So anything coming out of those areas, we get an early look at, I guess. And the other one is networking. So with the Research Data Alliance interest groups and stuff like that, you see a lot come through. I think within the ANZ library space, there's lots of good webinars where information comes through. But I think networks are going to be key in a lot of this, just sharing knowledge and just tapping into the various partnerships or groups. So it's the only way.
Actually, one thing too, just around the trust thing, because we've been involved in a lot of these projects, now people will actually come to us and say, oh, we've got this new thing that you guys might be interested in, because they know that we kind of do the same sort of work as well.
That's interesting, because I think librarians often have that level of trusted relationship with their clients as well, so it's something that we have in common. What do you think the level of understanding of data management is within our researchers and the research community? We've spent a lot of time upskilling and we're still working on it, as are you. But what do you think the research community skill level's like?
There was an interesting project, so I could talk specifically about Griffith, but there was a project recently that we did with the local government associations, the LGA groups and things like that. And it was basically sharing CSIRO data with researchers from a whole lot of institutions. So we were just looking after the data component. It was quite interesting. For most people, they're interested in what they need to do, the work that they need to do now. They don't really care about the rest of the ecosystem. It's just, these are the things I need and I want them now and I want to do it now. So a lot of just-in-time stuff is obviously quite good for those types of people. It was very rare in that project, and I'm using that one as an example because we're talking about people from all institutions kind of thing across Australia. It was very rare that people seemed to have a really comprehensive understanding around data management practices, for example. And when we'd mention things, they'd be like, oh, actually that sounds like a really good idea. Maybe we should back up our data. Yeah, we'll give that a go. And it makes sense that they're probably a bit confused because there's a million products. Like even in our environment for a researcher, I mean, we've got 3 different types of research storage that are available that do different things for different people. It's hard for them to know, and people are only interested in what they need to know, really. And I think that's the key, is the just-in-time and making it available and easy to find out. That's my take.
And I think the other thing is just looking at the demographics too. And, you know, it's a bit hard to change behaviour, or someone who's 50 or 60 years old doing research, they're working quite well. And a lot of the data management activities have probably been done by their PhD students or early careers. So I guess the other thing is about figuring out who you want to target to reskill or change behaviours. So, and Andrew's quite right. People are only interested in what interests them, not interested in the broader scheme of things.
This is going to be my last question, so I'm going to give you all a moment to transition from listeners to speakers and have a think about what questions you would like to ask in a moment. But I guess what I'm curious about, so this is just an off-the-cuff one, what's been your most interesting or challenging information management challenge in the projects that you've worked on? I know certainly we in our industry face them at various points, but I'm curious if you can think of an example where something struck you and it's been particularly problematic and you've had to be creative and come up with a solution.
If we're just looking for funny anecdotes, not necessarily about information management, but kind of related, more about data capture. So probably the two that I'm thinking about is one particular early career researcher who was doing drug use studies, and I was trying, and it was related to surveys and things like that, and explaining why just your friend cohort is a bad use of sample size, because maybe there's something in her lifestyle that was indicating perhaps there were a lot of drug users in her cohort, and that wouldn't be representative. The other one I was going to mention, and this is actually a late career researcher, which is another interesting one, is we were asked to produce a system that would produce random, allocations on whether people, which we did, and then she was thinking our system was broken because the numbers weren't perfectly even, and it was like, no, it's random. And she said, but shouldn't it be 50-50? It's like, random. And it took longer than you would think to explain the concept to someone who's doing statistical research that 50-50 is different to random.
I can't think of it.
That's not what you meant though, is it?
I suppose in some ways most of them are interesting because if they were easy, they'd probably be using commercial products. So most of what we're doing is bespoke type solutions. Things like standards and stuff like that and protocols and policies, they're the things that remain the same. How you cobble together a solution is probably the more complex one.
Actually, I thought of a serious answer. So with the ICLIM project that we were doing, the one that was mentioned before that Rebecca Brown was working on, so that was working, as I said, with a lot of Pacific Island governments and trying to get data sharing between, for example, the Bureau of Meteorology and the energy sector on those. So there was a lot of negotiation around sharing data, and it started off as just, you guys have the data, we just want to collect the metadata and put it in here. And the project eventually became, look, we'll give you repository technology and you can store your data wherever you want in this technology. And so the whole project actually evolved from one of just helping collect data across the region into addressing actual national government's data management needs, because they really didn't have a lot of resource and skill in that area. Because we're talking quite small countries as well, and it's, it's other people's job in a sense for them. They're just like, well, this is 50% of my job is to manage data for the Bureau of Meteorology, and the other 50% is something else. You know what I mean? So I think that was probably the most interesting and eye-opening one, that the data, there's a lot of data out there, like there's millions of dollars of research projects in that area, and a lot of that money and the outputs of those projects just disappears. So probably just the sheer volume of research data that disappears into different national government, filing cabinets. There was one particular place where they would actually get the digital reports, print them out, like they'd get an electronic copy, print them out and literally put them in a filing cabinet. And this is like, millions of dollars worth of research data, and that was their way to keep it secure, because they didn't have a secure mechanism for storing data. So that was a bit of an eye-opener.
So I'm going to throw over to you guys now and ask if there are any questions from anyone who's been listening. And Justine has the roving mic as well, so.
Thanks. Andrew, you mentioned before the issues of attribution when you get a mixed whole heap of data from a whole heap of places. Is there any move to use blockchain technology to try and accommodate all that?
Not for our projects at this stage, but I think that would definitely be not a bad idea. It's a very emergent technology in terms of, because I mostly associate it with sort of Bitcoin and that sort of thing. So I haven't really don't know too much about it in terms of the research attribution context. I've encountered it in different contexts, but it's actually a very intriguing idea. But we're not looking at it.
Gentlemen, the budget's required for what we might call high performance computing, or just the expectation of storage, you know, speed, all of those kind of things, seemingly could swallow up our entire budgets in a moment. Do you see that becoming any more sustainable, and/or what's, you know, what are the catalysts to make that more affordable? Because at the moment, it just doesn't seem like we've got a big enough, endless bucket to meet that demand.
There's probably two parts to that question. So you're talking in the institution or nationally? So one of the things we're doing right now in the institution is to try and use cloud services for our HPC. And keeping in mind, high performance computing is not a single thing. There's multiple types of jobs and stuff like that. So the sorts of things you can run on the Amazon Web Services and the Nectar infrastructure, but there's solutions out there, and I don't think we've exhausted them all yet, but we can get most of them from cloud service providers, whether it's the Nectar one or Amazon, except for some very remaining few quite bespoke jobs. Nationally, I don't think that need's going to go away because there's just more data to process. What has probably been happening to date is that because the price of hardware has been dropping, they haven't actually optimised the way they're doing it. So long term, if they want to make that more sustainable, they've got to get much more productive about processing data, because even within our place, most of the researchers will just run an algorithm, but they won't optimise it because there's plenty of horsepower out there. It doesn't matter. Did you want to?
So I'll probably add 2 points to that one. So in terms of the optimization question, when you start going out to Amazon, the skill and the optimization actually starts to make a difference because they're paying for the infrastructure in that scenario. The other thing I was just going to raise with the NCRIS funding that we were talking about earlier, what they're ostensibly, or what the government is ostensibly doing with that is creating shared infrastructure. So NCI, like the National Compute Infrastructure, QSIF here has something called Uramu and Flashlight, which are the two HPCs that are funded out of the Nectar money. And the idea with the NCRIS stuff is it's all shared. So the government's basically going, we're going to give you money to do a lot of this fancy stuff, but on the proviso that you share with everybody else. So you'll notice a lot of money went to the fabrication facility that does all the carbon nanotubes and all that sort of fun stuff. Again, the proviso is we'll buy you the big shiny bits of kit, but you've got to share. So the trick for us in terms of institutions is how we can transition our users onto those bits of infrastructure, because it's a little bit harder because you're suddenly negotiating with another uni going, well, we need people to be able to log into this system. It'd be lovely if you could sort that out.
Like Big Bang Theory.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Do we have any other questions? No, I think that's it. I think you're off the hook, guys. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you all for coming back. So for the latter part of the program, we thought it would be appropriate to spend a little bit of time reflecting on QULOC's history from two perspectives, that of the former QULOC executive officer and former QULOC convener. So providing this afternoon's reflections from the ex-executive officer point of view is Wendy Abbott. Wendy has worked at Bond University since 2002 and has been university librarian since 2013. She's had a long involvement with QULOC, including a stint as the QULOC executive officer from 1993 to 1994, and has been a long-term member and sometime chair of the Staffing Issues Working Party from 2004 to 2012. She's currently a member of the University Librarians Committee and mentor to the Learning and Information Services Working Party. Wendy is a self-confessed QULOC aficionado and has written, co-authored 2 articles on QULOC, both published in Australian academic and research libraries. Welcome, Wendy.
Thank you. So this is when my history catches up with me. So at today's forum, we're celebrating the 25th anniversary of QULOC, and I'm honoured to share with you some of my recollections of the early days of QULOC and actually BULOC. So in 93-94, I had the opportunity to be the executive officer for QULOC, and I think I'll be one of the few people here who still remembers those very early days. Is there anybody else here who remembers BULOC, who was part of BULOC? No? Nobody? Wow. Makes me feel old. So I'm going to tell you a little of the story of the formation of the organisation and share with you some of my experiences. So BULOC, or Brisbane University Library's Office of Cooperation, was established at a time of one of the most significant periods of change in higher education in Australia. Between 1987 and 90, higher education in Australia was transformed from a two-tiered system of 19 universities and 44 colleges of advanced education into 36 relatively large and more comprehensive universities. Staff were moved to new institutions, campuses were realigned to make new universities, and different library systems had to be melded together, not to mention Dewey and LC being melded together. With so much change afoot, the original BULOC was initiated in 1991 by the university librarians of the three Brisbane universities, Brian Cook at Griffith University, Gaynor Austin at Queensland University of Technology, and Derek Fielding at the University of Queensland. Brian was the original convener and a driving force for BULOC. I don't think it would have happened if Brian hadn't pushed it through. The three institutions had collaborated on projects of mutual interest before, but BULOC gave it a framework that would enable the collaboration to take place on a much wider basis and in a more organised manner. The university librarians quickly identified areas of potential cooperation and set up a number of working parties. The climate for collaboration was favourable, as many of the librarians joining the working parties had moved between universities as a result of the amalgamations and had experience, knowledge and understanding, and maybe even shared loyalties to more than one institution. And this created a great environment for good relationships, sharing of expertise, and a chance to rethink and improve services. By 1993, Janice Rickards had taken on the role of University Librarian at Griffith and BULOC convener, and there was a growing interest in joining BULOC from other institutions around the state. So from very early on in 93, BULOC expansion was well underway. It was initially envisaged that just the southeast corner would come together first with the regional universities, CQU and JCU, to join later, but agreement was reached very quickly, and so BULOC expanded into QULOC, and the State Library was given observer status. In expanding BULOC, other names for the new organisation were considered. Some people were a little bit unhappy with the LOC and wanted it to be UNLOC. And then there was QLib was another suggestion. But the BULOC brand name was already well established, and morphing from BULOC into QULOC maintained the momentum and the goodwill. And so, there was obviously a strong Queensland focus, but it was agreed that the lines that divide states are quite arbitrary, and there was no reason to not collaborate across the borders into New South Wales and Northern Territory. So Southern Cross University became a member in 1994 after separating, that was a de-amalgamation, from the University of New England, which joined later in 2000. The University of the Sunshine Coast joined in 2000 as well, and Charles Darwin University joined in 2001. And just for the record, Charles Sturt University was also a member of QULOC from 2007 to 2011. And one of the things about the early days is there are no photos, so I had to make up my own. There were no photos until about 2000. I think we just didn't think of it. I don't know why. And if anybody in the audience has early photos of QULOC events, it would be great to let Justine have them. So in the first 2 years of cooperation, BULOC had projects which were ahead of their time, funded by significant ARC infrastructure grants. One was for a database system that could handle the vernacular scripts of Chinese, Japanese and Korean, and that was to enhance access to the significant Asian language collections at Griffith and UQ. And that one eventually became a National Library project. And the other was for a system to link together the catalogues of the three BULOC libraries, and it was called LibLink. And these were cutting-edge projects at the time. And remember, this is in the very early or almost pre-internet days when networking between organisations was a major challenge. So the issues of the day in the early 90s revolved around award restructuring. It was a major effort to get all higher education staff onto a uniform award, and enterprise bargaining. The Cooperative Resources Working Party was investigating opportunities for sharing distributed collections across the region, looking at duplication of print serials and also databases, which at the time were mainly on CD-ROM and not many were networked. Staff development was one of the earliest and has been one of the most enduring of all the focuses for QULOC. And one of the early schemes was called the Travelling Trainers Program. In-house trainers with strong skill sets were identified and a roster of travelling trainers was set up, whereby the identified trainer would go to other libraries and run training sessions for the staff of that institution. So that was a way of sharing training skills. Some people in the audience remember that. And so, you know, the topics were supervisory skills, customer service, performance evaluation, and the hottest topic was understanding CD-ROM. It's a bit of a change from the last presentation, isn't it? Going low-tech here. So, staff secondments was another focus. This program allowed staff the opportunity to be seconded temporarily, usually 6 to 12 months, to another QULOC library. The program also included the State Library and Queensland TAFE libraries, and it is now badged as the Inter-Organisational Experience Program, and is still available and can be negotiated between interested parties. Another focus was the document delivery, standardising reciprocal borrowing between the QULOC members, and this was a very early precursor of what we now know as University Libraries of Australia and New Zealand. Does anybody remember the Cuckoo scheme? Okay, so the Cuckoo scheme came under the umbrella of QULOC as well in the early days, and in this scheme, Griffith, QUT, Southern Cross, USQ and Bond University employed staff, and these were the Cuckoos, who were located at UQ, who were the owners of the nest. So this scheme meant that interlibrary loan requests could be processed quickly and cheaply and sent back to the home libraries in what was, you know, a pre-internet, pre-digital world. But nevertheless, technology has been an enduring focus for QULOC, and ARNet, which had been launched in Australia around 1989, became the centrepiece of the ARNet Working Party from 92 onwards. At the time, email was quite primitive. Does anybody remember Pegasus email? Yes, we all used email a lot, but other internet services such as the World Wide Web were still in development. Today, it's hard to imagine a world without pervasive access to the internet, but in the early days of QULOC, ARNet was a new and exciting development for sharing information. While the World Wide Web was evolving at CERN in Switzerland, in Australia, the great potential of the internet was not very well understood yet, although staff in computing centres, IT departments and libraries, in universities and in research organisations all were vitally interested in and could envisage already some of the big changes that were on the horizon. Librarians were quick to learn the new technology with a view to providing training for academic staff and students, so provision of training programs was an early focus for the ARNet Working Party. Other topics were the CWIS, or the Campus-Wide Information System, and how to develop your Gophers. Gopher was a protocol that was a text-based forerunner of HTTP in the World Wide Web. One major undertaking for the ARNet Working Party in January of '94 was an ARNet workshop called Panning for Network Gold. So we had planned a very busy day-long program starting at 9, and I'll never forget the day of this workshop. We had almost 50 staff attending, many from regional areas, all coming to the Griffith Nathan campus. On the day, there was some horrendous traffic snarl-up, which affected all the major roads in the city. So those flying in and driving in had great difficulty getting to the campus. Once they did arrive all hot and bothered, the tea and coffee on arrival had long gone cold, and there was no time for it anyway, which made everybody even crankier. Nevertheless, the day was a success due to the wonderful presenters who worked around these difficulties. But ever after, QULOC events have usually been scheduled to start later, say at 9:30 or 10, to give regional members a chance to get there with an earlier finish to enable the return trip home. As they say, you never forget the lessons you learn from your mistakes. Like many people involved in QULOC, I gained a great deal from my role as the executive officer and from all my subsequent involvement on working parties. As the executive officer, I organised and attended the meetings of the university librarians and all the working parties. I prepared the agendas, minutes, produced flyers for workshops and events, wrote newsletters and supported the working parties in every way they needed. And generally, it was a matter of trying to keep all the balls in the air at the same time. It was an exciting and challenging role and a transformative experience professionally. Prior to this, I had been a circulation librarian, a cataloguing librarian and a faculty librarian, and the role of QULOC Executive Officer gave me the opportunity to work with librarians from many different libraries and to see behind the scenes where there were so many exciting discoveries to be made. And it was a wonderful education in all the vital issues of the day. It was also an opportunity to observe and work with the different leadership styles and learn from the university librarians. I'm sure that all the executive officers who came after me had similar exceptional experiences while they have gone on to enhance and develop the role. And I see we have quite a few former executive officers here, as well as our current Justine, thank you, and Kate, who's a former exec officer, Lynette Reville, I saw Lynette before, Lucy Peachy, I saw Lucy before, Kerry McLaren. Yeah, so well done guys, you've all done a really terrific job. In concluding, I'll share a couple of comments from QULOC members. QULOC, this is one comment, QULOC is probably the best professional development program in the country. Another person said, QULOC is great. I found it invaluable throughout my career in making professional contacts, getting stimulation and good ideas and professional development that complements rather than replaces my own institution's professional development, as well as good long-term friends. It's also a good way for librarians to get leadership experience and experience in running things in a non-threatening environment. So from these early beginnings, QULOC has led the way as a successful collaborative organisation that continues to be well positioned in the academic library environment of the future. And if you want to read any more about the QULOC story, a little bit of promotion of the article. The first one listed there, I must say, it's much more Justine than me, but I did write the early one back in '93. So thank you.
So now I'm curious about the cuckoo's nest at UQ. So our last speaker today, the man standing between you and the drinks and canapes, is Graham Black from Central Queensland University. Graham is currently Associate Vice Chancellor for the Southeast Queensland region and is responsible for the management of the City Centre campus. The campus has over 1,000 international and domestic students and is conveniently located close to Brisbane's major public transport. Graham is eager to promote the campus as a study centre for distance education students. The campus offers distance students a learning hub with a range of activities and facilities, including library, student support, meeting and tutorial rooms, student workstations, and wireless networking. Previously, Graham worked as director of CQ University Library in Rockhampton, and Graham will be providing some reflections as a former convener of QULOC. Graham?
Great, thanks Bob, and thanks for that background. I just wonder which website you got all that from, so thanks very much. I'd certainly like to thank QULOC for inviting me to speak here today at its 25th anniversary celebrations, and I'd like to acknowledge all the former and current QULOC members, university librarians, and the executive officers and those members of working parties who could make it. It certainly brings back some memories. It's certainly an honour to be invited to speak, but it's also a humbling experience to be selected from a stellar cast of past and present QULOC conveners and university librarians. So I hope I do my colleagues justice as I reminisce about QULOC. I'm going to refer to some facts, some memories, which will probably be a bit hazy, and also a few opinions, which won't be too controversial. Now, before I get into the body of my presentation, for some of you I probably need to explain my dress code. It was a great, I was torn actually of what to wear today. Whether to wear a suit because it was a formal anniversary or to wear a bright shirt. I had coffee with Sandra up at University of the Sunshine Coast, and I was telling her about my angst, and she said, "Oh, please wear a shirt," and I said, "I can't, it's not Friday." So Sandra, I've changed the tradition of many years to wear a shirt like this today, so thanks. Now, to prepare for today's presentation, Justine sent me some copies of some annual reports, newsletters and university librarian minutes. So it was a real blast from the past, and thanks, Justine. Now, I've also scoured the QULOC website for some background information. Now, to ensure it doesn't all go to waste on me, I thought I'd run a quiz. Oh, hang on. A trivia quiz on QULOC. So, the questions will be drawn from my research as well as my memory, so a couple of the answers might be incorrect that you can see at the end, but I was going to say you can't dial a friend, but I've actually dialed a friend because I sat next to Wendy, so I was able to pump her for some things to make sure some of my facts were correct, so thanks, Wendy. These questions will be displayed as I go through my presentation, and for those of you on the far reaches of QULOC world, I'll read them out. Now, there's no prize, only the satisfaction of knowing that you could be the QULOC Trivia Champion for 2016. The first question is, now Wendy has given some of these answers away, but anyhow, that's the first question. So think about this while I'm going through, and if I look up and see that people are looking down, you're obviously referring to the website. Now, as Wendy mentioned, I'll just cover a bit of some of the history that Wendy has already mentioned, so please excuse me for that. QULOC started off life in 1991 as a formalised collaborative arrangement amongst three university libraries, University of Queensland, QUT and Griffith. Sometime during those first couple of years, James Cook University and the new Dawkins universities, the University of Southern Queensland and the University of Central Queensland, were invited to participate at the meetings. And as we know, in May 1993, QULOC was formed with the inclusion of all Queensland University libraries and the State Library of Queensland as an observer member. I can still remember the day up in Rockhampton when Judith Edwards, our university librarian, returned from Brisbane to proudly announced that we were now part of QULOC. We had joined the club. It was really quite a momentous event for us, coming from a CIE to a university college to a university and being admitted to QULOC. It was a source of great pride, particularly for Judith. And what a club it's been. QULOC has always remained true to its fundamental goals and values. Over the years, the wordsmiths have had their go at the strategic plan and the mission and the goals, but essentially they've stayed the same. And the ones that you have on the website at the moment are probably the best I've read and also the shortest, so I congratulate whoever developed those. And I'm sure you all know them, but I'll read them out for you just to remind you. Develop the capability of our member libraries and their staff. Collaborate across member libraries to deliver strategic, cost-effective and value-added library services. Partner with Queensland agencies to enhance research, scholarship and innovation. And the values: learning, development and innovation, collegiality, networking and knowledge sharing, and the richness of our diversity. Now, the one thing QULOC hasn't been hung up on is its Queensland exclusivity. Despite Queensland's supremacy in the state of origin, Queensland has been happy to adopt UNE and Southern Cross from across the border, as well as Charles Darwin up in the Northern Territory, and they have become, for all intents and purposes, honorary Queensland libraries. Now, Wendy mentioned it, but for those of you new on the scene, Charles Sturt University was once a member of QULOC. And when Charles Sturt was a member of QULOC, QULOC comprised a third of all university libraries in Australia. I remember one call meeting, this is probably more of a topic for discussion at dinner than now, but Des Stewart and I had had a few beers at dinner. Excuse me. We were actually trying to encourage some New Zealand libraries to join us. But anyhow. So the next question is, which QULOC member institution isn't yet mentioned in the QULOC history section of the About QULOC webpage? And I say yet because after today it might be. Now, my involvement in QULOC stems for 20 of the 25 years of QULOC's existence. I spent the first 10 years as a member of the various working parties and the last 10 years as a university librarian. Over those long years, I had the pleasure of meeting and working with some very talented colleagues across the spectrum of QULOC libraries. And Wendy touched on it. I think one of the things that really differentiates QULOC from other similar state bodies, and even CALL, is the focus on real collaboration, information sharing, and I think the really most important thing is the staff development for staff right across the library, not just the university librarians and the senior librarians. Those values of collegiality, networking and knowledge sharing were integral when I first became involved way back in 1993, and I can see from today that they're still integral today. I was convener of QULOC in 2008 to 2010. In my experience, becoming a QULOC convener is more of a process of anointment by the group, not by an individual. And it's really quite a straightforward process. There's no sort of white smoke at the end of the process of burning of paper up a chimney like they do in the Vatican. First part of the process, and for colleagues and former colleagues, correct me if I'm wrong, the first question is, who's done it before? Because if you've done it before, you're out. Secondly, which institution has done it recently? It's often number one excludes number two, but not always. So if you're a new UL and your institution's done it recently, you're out as well. Thirdly, who's only new to the UL role? Because if you are new or brand new, you're out as well because you need to focus on your new job. So invariably, of those of you who are left, who would like to do it? Now, there is generally some jostling to avoid the role. But someone invariably puts their hand up, or they're pushed forward, or like Russian volunteers, all but one step back. They then become the QULOC convener for 2 years. So the next question is, who's been QULOC convener more than once? Now, as Wendy mentioned, the convener works quite closely with the executive officer to manage QULOC. It's a role that really is the keys to the success of QULOC, as they really are the glue. Without the hard work of the EOs, many of the things QULOC achieved and continues to achieve would not have been possible. So I'd like to say special thanks to all the former EOs who are here, and especially to Anne Ritchie and Lynette Reville. Lynette's here today, who guided me through my time as convener. So this is a question that Wendy gave the answer to, but I'm not going to tell you. Collaboration has been defined as an unnatural act performed by non-consenting adults. My experience was that QULOC working parties turned this definition on its head. The working parties is really what differentiates QULOC from other state-based bodies and even CALL. And it's only in recent years that CALL has adopted a similar model. And it's through the working parties where the real value of QULOC is manifest. Networking, knowledge sharing, collaboration, and it's by staff across a range of disciplines with a range of skills and expertise, and also a range of levels. Staff from all member organisations had the opportunity to be involved in projects, share information and participate in workshops. I know from my days on the working parties, finding out what was happening at other libraries provided great insights into what was being done and what was possible. Coming from a regional, smaller and less well-resourced library, I and my staff were able to share experiences and knowledge. Sometimes we would be in awe, sometimes shock, sometimes horror, just joking, at what our colleagues from other libraries were doing. At other times, we felt that we were leading rather than following, so it was a really good opportunity to see how you were placed in the marketplace, so to speak. From a regional university perspective, the working parties and the workshops they hosted provided invaluable opportunities for exposing staff to new ideas, initiatives, concepts and technologies. And it's without the sharing of knowledge by all participants, and in particular, I'd like to pay tribute to the 3 large metropolitan university libraries for their generosity of sharing their information and expertise for the benefit of all QULOC members. So the next question is, so is everybody rattling, thinking? The working parties are by no means static instruments of QULOC. Their focus has changed over the years to reflect the important issues and developments in the operation of our university libraries. While I was convener in 2009, the working parties were the Information Communications and Technology, Information Resources and Access, Information Skills and Services, Lending and Document Delivery, Staffing Issues and Research Support. Over time, changes were necessary to better reflect university libraries' operating environments. Information Skills and Services became Learning and Information Services, and Lending and Document Delivery became Access Services and Spaces. We also had a quality group for a while. It had its day in the sun, but it got to the stage where it became redundant, and so the working party was disbanded. Now here's a question for you. To take you back in time, here are some of the highlights from the 2009 annual report, and I'll leave it up to you to decide whether things have progressed or not. All working parties trialled the access grid or video conferencing. The ICT working party used Illuminate online collaboration technology. Site visits included RFID facilities at USQ Harvey Bay, which sounded like a junket to me. I'm sure there was some whale watching that happened at the same time, but anyhow. Service desk at ACU Banyo, new medical and oral health libraries at Griffith, and refurbished libraries at Bond, the State Library and at Griffith University. The hot topics of the year included roving service, staff development, discovery layers, allocation models, inquiry management, and of course, how could I forget, information literacy. The newly formed research support working party discussed ERA, research portfolio, scholarly communication life cycle, and good practice. And it certainly, I could see a huge leap between those discussions of those days and some of the things we've heard about today. There were a range of practitioner meetings were held and workshops were held on staff selection, e-learning options and planning, e-texts and e-books, scholarly publishing, the ubiquitous EndNote Masterclass, planning for a dynamic future, and open source versus off-the-shelf software. Now, I've briefly referred to the great work of the executive officers and highlighted the valuable work of the working parties. So now it's time for me to turn my attention to the university librarians. Now, what can I say about my colleagues past and present? Not much. The success or otherwise of QULOC rests with the university librarian group at the time. As the board, they focus on QULOC's governance, strategy, finances, all those sorts of fun things. A number of ULs act as mentors for the working groups, and this provides an effective conduit between the university librarian group and the working parties. If the system's working properly, the ULs are informed about what's going on in the working parties, and the mentors are able to provide the working parties with guidance from the ULs. And I put guidance in inverted commas, because I can assure you there has been many a discussion at a ULs meeting about the need to keep working parties on track rather than letting them get carried away by the enthusiasm of their members. And I can see some of my past colleagues there raising their eyebrows and smiling. So here's one related to the question for the working parties. What did QULOC launch in 2010? Sandra, you should know this. It was in your in the annual report that you wrote that year. A library's involvement in QULOC is very often determined by the involvement of the university librarian at the time. From my recollection, university librarians have almost always been universally supportive of the work of QULOC. However, during my time as convener, we did have some concern about the involvement of the University of Queensland. The university librarian at the time was not engaged as a mentor with his working group, and his attendance at the university librarians meeting was patchy at best. Unfortunately, the staff at UQ at the time were very much ingrained in QULOC, and it was through their participation and engagement with QULOC that we weathered that storm. And it was a bit ironic, I suppose, me talking about this, and that I heard a conversation just before I came in. There's another university that's probably operating in a similar sort of way. But I sincerely hope that the staff see the benefit of it, and that they certainly urge management to be involved, to continue to be involved. Now, as I mentioned before, the ULs group concerned itself with the exciting areas of governance, strategy and finances. And during my time on QULOC, we discussed these heady things: the QULOC strategic plan, approving workshops, setting fees, endorsing forms, which was not inevitably a topic of great discussion, collection valuation policies, copyright, relations with other state and national bodies, including government. While discussions were collegial, there wasn't always agreement. While I can't ever recall participating in a formal vote, I can certainly recall the group having to work through issues and perspectives to come to an agreed position. The diversity of QULOC is one of its strengths, and at times, but not often, it also proved to be a little problematic. But there's nothing unusual with that when you have a diverse group. Now, convening a group of very smart people with common interests but different perspectives can be challenging at times. If you're aspiring to be a UL and a convener of QULOC, the one tip that I would give you is to always ask yourself, what is the most difficult question that could be asked, and am I prepared for it? Because if you don't, you'll be found out. As a university librarian of a regional university, I looked forward to the 3 university librarians meetings each year. It gave me an opportunity to provide input into the direction of QULOC. It provided a valuable opportunity to meet with my colleagues and to discuss and compare notes. And let me assure you, for those of you who aren't university librarians, the collegiality, networking and knowledge sharing was just as important at the university librarian meetings as it was at the working party meetings. Apart from determining who was going to be the next QULOC convener, there were 2 big decisions that the university's librarians group had to make on a regular basis. And they were, what was the format of the next University Librarians Forum going to be, and where would the biennial non-South East Queensland University Librarians meeting be held? I'm sure things have moved on since then. Now, the annual University Librarians Forum was a popular event, and it still is. It was also the source of much angst for the university librarians. In the main, staff who attended enjoyed listening to the UL speak on various topics, and they certainly enjoyed the Q&A sessions where the university librarians opened up about various issues and also their experiences. Deciding on the location, format and speakers were challenging issues. Regular venues included the State Library Auditorium, University of Queensland Library and Griffith here at the South Bank. One year we even took the UL's forum on the road to the Gold Coast, where we had a big day which included tours of the then upgraded Bond University Library and the Griffith University Library. And during my time on QULOC, we commenced video streaming. Pleased to see that it's still continuing. Now, determining who was going to speak at the University Librarians Forum was a bit like the anointment process for the picking the convener. If you've done it last year, you were out, so that was a sense of relief. Who had something new to talk about was another thing. I don't, it would go around the table. I do, good, you're it. And the other one was, who's not here? And they invariably got selected. And I also think that's how I got selected for today, because I wasn't at the meeting. Now, during my time on QULOC, we followed the tradition of the university's librarians meeting outside South East Queensland. And this occurred every 2 years. I was fortunate to travel to Darwin, Orange, Cairns and Armidale and to host a meeting, I think it was my final meeting, in Rockhampton. These were always enjoyable and informative trips, not only for the change of scenery, but also to see and hear the developments and achievements and issues of our regional colleagues. There's one trip, and I'm sure those who attended it, you've got the same feeling. There's one trip that will stick in my mind for a long time. It was our trip to Armidale in 2007. It was a hoot for all sorts of reasons. But the main reason was that we chartered a 7-seater aircraft to take us from Brisbane to Armidale, as there were no direct flights. One of our colleagues from Brisbane, who shall remain nameless and who isn't here, didn't like small planes, so they took a commercial flight. Catherine Ashley, our EO at the time, was a former parachutist, but she'd developed a dislike for small planes. So I think Catherine's knuckles were white all the way down and back. But the rest of us, it was a great trip. The plane took off from Archerfield. It was, we waited at a little terminal there. It was an Art Deco sort of place. This plane pulls up beside, the pilot comes in, people for Armidale, we put our hands up, out we walked, put our bags in the plane and off we went. It was no security. It was just, I guess, how they used to travel in days gone by. Obviously, we didn't fly as high as the commercial aircraft, so we had great views. And you realise how much, even in those small planes, is done by automatic control. Jim, I think you had a front seat and you had a great time with the cans on your head and talking to the pilot. Once we arrived at, we obviously made it safely and back. And once we arrived at Archerfield, I had to travel back to Eagle Farm. Now, as the plane and the pilot were based at Eagle Farm, I hitched a ride back. And that was a real hoot, flying over the city, getting these fantastic views. Now, I should also add, in all seriousness, that even the staff at UNE were tremendous and informative hosts, and I think it was actually one of the meetings where we discussed the QULOC strategic plan, so that very quickly brought us back to earth. So here's a question for those of you who are on the trip. What type of light aircraft did we fly on? I could go on, but I'll leave and save any more stories for drinks and dinner later this evening. As you could probably tell, I enjoyed my involvement with QULOC. It was certainly interesting, it was always rewarding, and it was inevitably enjoyable. And as we are celebrating the 25th anniversary of QULOC, I'd like to take a moment to thank and congratulate the 3 founding university librarians of QULOC, Brian Cook, Derek Fielding and Gaynor Austin, for their vision in founding what has become a dynamic and evolving organisation. So here's my last question, and before I go, here's the answer to the quiz, and thanks for listening.
So that concludes the formal program this afternoon. I'd like to once again thank all of our speakers. So Mitchell, Malcolm, Andrew, Louise, Wendy, and Graham, can we give them a round of applause? I'd also like to thank Griffith University for hosting today's event and for the technical support they provided, and a special thanks to Justine, who's put a huge amount of effort, and as Graham said, the EO role is really the glue that keeps QULOC together, so it's an important role, and thanks, Justine. Are drinks ready? Excellent. Thank you all.